The tow rope was vibrating at a frequency that Flight Lieutenant David Cooper had never felt before. Not in his 31 previous glider tow missions over North Africa, and not during 18 months of training flights over England. The Waco glider behind his C-47 transport was bucking violently in turbulence generated by wind that shouldn't have existed according to the meteorological forecast that Wing Commander Morrison had read confidently during the briefing 6 hours ago. It was July 9th, 1943, approximately 10:47 p.m., and Cooper was flying over the Mediterranean Sea south of Sicily with a glider full of 32 British paratroopers who were supposed to capture a bridge before dawn, but who were instead going to drown because the mission planning had ignored basic physics that Cooper had explained in writing 5 weeks earlier. Wind from the northeast was gusting to 45 miles per hour when the forecast had predicted 20. The gliders were swinging wildly on their tow ropes like pendulums in a storm, and Cooper had already watched 2 ropes snap completely, sending 2 gliders plummeting into the dark water below with 64 men who had no chance of survival. His radio crackled with a friendly fire, warning that made everything infinitely worse. Allied naval forces positioned off the Sicilian coast were firing at the transport stream because they hadn't been properly briefed about friendly aircraft approaching at night and had assumed the C-47s were enemy bombers. Tracer rounds lit the sky in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't lethal. Flak bursts surrounded the transports with explosions that created turbulence on top of the wind, turbulence that was already making controlled flight nearly impossible. Cooper watched a C-47 approximately 200 meters to his left take multiple hits and start burning. The pilot released his glider early in a desperate attempt to save his own crew, but releasing early meant the glider dropped straight into the ocean from 800 feet with no possibility of reaching shore. 32 more men gone. Drowned or killed on impact. Lost because the naval forces weren't coordinated, and because the wind was twice the forecast strength, and because everything Cooper had warned about in his report was happening exactly as he'd predicted. This wasn't a military operation. This was a massacre unfolding in real time, and Cooper was part of it whether he wanted to be or not. Every warning he'd given 5 weeks ago was proving accurate tonight while hundreds of men died. Cooper gripped the controls tighter and tried to maintain steady flight despite turbulence that was making the aircraft shudder. He wanted to give his glider the smoothest possible ride, wanted to give those 32 men behind him the best chance of survival, but physics didn't negotiate, and wind didn't care about pilot skill. When another C-47 exploded to his right in a fireball that briefly illuminated the entire sky, Cooper made the decision to release his glider early at 700 feet altitude, approximately 2 miles offshore, giving the pilots a chance to land on water near the coast rather than crash in flames or get shot down by friendly fire. He pulled the tow release, felt the rope go slack, watched the glider disappear into darkness behind him, hoped they survived the water landing. Knew most of them probably wouldn't, because Waco gliders sank within minutes when they hit water, and men wearing combat equipment couldn't swim in Mediterranean swells at night. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. Cooper turned his C-47 away from Sicily and headed back toward North Africa, flying away from the disaster that was consuming the invasion force, away from the operation that should never have been launched with these wind conditions, away from the catastrophe that one British pilot had tried to prevent through official warnings that military bureaucracy had dismissed as overcautious pessimism from someone who didn't understand the bigger picture. This is the story of the ignored prophet who predicted disaster with mathematical precision. The pilot who calculated the physics of failure and was dismissed by planning staff who trusted manufacturer specifications over operational experience. The warnings that were filed away and forgotten. The catastrophe that proved every prediction correct while killing the men those predictions should have saved. 5 weeks earlier, on May 28, 1943, Cooper had been sitting in a briefing room at RAF Kairouan in Tunisia, listening to Wing Commander James Morrison outline plans for Operation Ladbroke, the airborne assault on Sicily that would kick off the Allied invasion of Europe. 7 glider missions would carry British troops to capture key bridges and defensive positions before the main amphibious landing at dawn. The objectives were critical, the coordination was complex, the timeline was ambitious, and everything depended on precise execution under conditions that matched the planning assumptions. Cooper had been flying glider tow missions for 18 months across 187 missions that included Waco gliders and Horsa gliders towed over England during training and over North Africa during operations. He'd flown in every weather condition imaginable, day and night, calm and storm, clear and overcast, light winds and heavy winds, and he understood the limitations of glider performance intimately through experience that couldn't be replicated in any briefing room or planning office. He knew what gliders could and couldn't do, knew the performance margins that determined success or failure, knew the safety factors that separated acceptable risk from guaranteed disaster, knew when ambitious plans exceeded actual capabilities, knew the critical difference between theoretical performance derived from manufacturer specifications and actual performance achieved in real-world conditions with combat loads and adverse weather. And he knew immediately, within the first 10 minutes of Morrison's briefing, that this plan was based on theoretical performance assumptions that would fail catastrophically when tested against Mediterranean wind conditions. Wing Commander Morrison outlined the plan with professional confidence that bordered on absolute certainty. Morrison was a staff officer who had spent most of the war planning operations from headquarters rather than flying them. He was excellent at coordination and logistics, excellent at making complex plans work perfectly on paper, but he had never personally flown a glider tow mission or felt a glider buck violently on the tow rope, or watched wind transform smooth flight into desperate struggle for control. He had never experienced the substantial gap between what technical specifications claimed gliders could do and what they actually did when conditions deviated even slightly from optimal. The plan called for 7 groups totaling 137 Waco CG-4A gliders, each carrying 30 to 32 men, infantry, engineers, signals personnel, for a total invasion force of 4,015 troops. Launch would occur from Tunisia at dusk. The formation would fly 300 miles across the Mediterranean to Sicily. Transport aircraft would release gliders at 600 feet altitude approximately 3 miles offshore. Gliders would navigate to their assigned landing zones using visual reference points and capture their objectives before dawn to support the main amphibious landing starting at first light. The plan sounded completely reasonable when Morrison presented it. Every element was calculated precisely. Every contingency had been planned for. Every identified risk had been assessed and mitigated through careful preparation. On paper, the operation worked perfectly, which was exactly the problem. It worked perfectly on paper under assumptions that weren't true in reality. The plan assumed glider performance specifications that didn't match actual capabilities. It assumed wind predictions that were optimistic at best and completely wrong at worst. It assumed coordination requirements between air and naval forces that were practically impossible to achieve. Cooper saw these problems immediately with the clarity that came from extensive operational experience rather than theoretical planning knowledge. He listened to Morrison's presentation while calculating mentally and identifying fundamental problems that would kill men if not addressed before the operation launched. These weren't subtle problems requiring deep analysis. They were basic physics problems that should have been obvious to anyone who understood aerodynamics and had actually flown gliders, rather than just reading about them in technical manuals. Cooper raised his hand carefully during the questions period. He didn't want to seem critical of senior officers in front of the entire briefing room, didn't want to challenge Morrison's planning publicly, but he needed to raise concerns that literally couldn't be ignored without accepting mass casualties. "Sir, what's the wind forecast for July 9th?" Morrison answered confidently while reading from his planning documents. 20 to 25 miles per hour from the northwest, standard summer conditions for the Mediterranean region, and well within acceptable parameters for glider operations according to the technical specifications. "And the planned release altitude, sir?" 600 feet over water, which gives the gliders approximately 3 miles of glide range to reach shore, adequate margin for navigation errors and landing zone approach adjustments. Cooper did the mathematics quickly in his head while Morrison was still talking. 600 feet altitude with a 25-mile-per-hour headwind and Waco CG-4A gliders that had manufacturer specifications claiming a 12-to-1 glide ratio in calm air conditions. 12-to-1 glide ratio meant 600 feet of altitude should theoretically provide 7,200 feet of horizontal glide range, which converted to approximately 1.4 miles of travel distance. But that was the theoretical specification. That was test performance achieved under optimal conditions that never existed in actual operations. Real-world performance was dramatically different when you accounted for wind effects. 25-mile-per-hour headwind didn't just reduce ground speed, it fundamentally changed the aerodynamic environment. Wind created additional drag over the wing surfaces. Wind generated turbulence that reduced lift efficiency. Wind increased the descent rate substantially beyond the calm air specification. The glider would descend much faster than the 200 feet per minute that manufacturer tests had measured. With 25-mile-per-hour headwind and turbulence effects from wind flowing over water surfaces, the actual descent rate would increase to somewhere between 400 and 600 feet per minute, depending on how violently the air was moving. And headwind reduced ground speed significantly. Glider airspeed was typically 65 miles per hour in optimal glide configuration. Subtract 25 miles per hour headwind, and you got 40 miles per hour ground speed, barely more than half the airspeed. Cooper ran the final calculation. 600 feet altitude divided by 600 feet per minute descent rate equaled 1 minute of flight time available. 40 miles per hour ground speed equaled approximately 0.67 miles per minute of travel. 1 minute of flight time meant 0.67 miles of glide range maximum, not 3 miles, not even the 1.4 miles that the manufacturer specification claimed. Less than 1 mile, less than half the distance needed to reach shore from the planned release point. The gliders would hit water. They would crash into the Mediterranean hundreds of meters from shore. They would sink immediately because Waco gliders weren't designed to float. Men would drown trapped inside gliders that were filling with water while weighted down by combat equipment that made swimming impossible. This wasn't speculation or pessimistic guessing. This was mathematics and physics and aerodynamics producing a completely predictable and entirely preventable disaster. "Sir, I calculate actual glide range at approximately half a mile to 1 mile maximum with 25-mile-per-hour headwind conditions. Not 3 miles. The gliders will hit water well before reaching shore." Morrison looked annoyed, as though Cooper was wasting valuable briefing time with amateur concerns that contradicted professional planning. "Flight Lieutenant, the planning staff has calculated glide performance using official manufacturer specifications for the Waco CG-4A. The glide ratio is 12-to-1, which means 600 feet altitude provides 7,200 feet of glide range, which equals 1.4 miles. Combined with a 3-mile release distance, That provides more than adequate safety margin for navigation variations and landing zone approach requirements. Your calculations are incorrect. Sir, with respect, manufacturer specifications reflect calm air performance, not 25-mile-per-hour headwind, not turbulent conditions over water surfaces, not real-world performance with combat loads and degraded aerodynamics from equipment loading. I've personally flown 187 glider tow missions. I've observed glider performance in every weather condition. I've watched how they actually behave in wind. With 25-mile-per-hour headwind and water surface turbulence, these gliders will descend at 500 to 600 feet per minute minimum. They'll have approximately 1 minute of flight time available. They physically cannot reach shore from a 3-mile release point. They will crash in water. Men will drown. The room became very quiet. Other pilots were watching the exchange carefully. Officers looked uncomfortable because this was becoming confrontational in a way that violated military protocol. Cooper was directly challenging senior staff planning, questioning the competence of experienced officers, implying that bureaucratic planning had failed to account for operational reality. In military culture, such challenges were professionally dangerous even when you were technically correct, especially when you were correct, because being right meant someone with more rank was wrong. Are you seriously suggesting that our planning staff doesn't understand basic aerodynamics? Are you implying that experienced officers with access to complete technical specifications and engineering support have made fundamental calculation errors that an operational pilot somehow noticed during a single briefing? Cooper chose his words carefully because he was navigating a minefield where professional survival competed with moral responsibility. Sir, I'm not questioning anyone's competence or understanding. I'm questioning the assumptions built into the plan. Manufacturer specifications represent theoretical performance under optimal conditions: calm air, optimal angle of attack, no turbulence, clean aerodynamic configuration. Those conditions don't exist over the Mediterranean Sea in summer, with 25-mile-per-hour winds generating surface turbulence. He paused to let that sink in before continuing with the technical details. Real-world performance in actual operational conditions is significantly lower than theoretical specifications. Let me walk through the mathematics. The Waco CG-4A specification claims 12:1 glide ratio, which is accurate under test conditions: calm air at sea level with optimal loading. But headwind doesn't just reduce ground speed, it fundamentally changes the aerodynamic environment. Cooper could see Morrison's impatience growing, but he pushed forward because lives depended on this explanation being heard and understood. 25-mile-per-hour headwind creates additional drag across the wing surfaces. It generates turbulence that reduces lift efficiency. Most critically, it increases the descent rate substantially. The calm air descent rate specification of 200 feet per minute assumes smooth airflow and optimal angle of attack. With headwind and turbulence over water, actual descent rate increases to 400, 500, possibly 600 feet per minute, depending on turbulence intensity. He pulled out a notepad and started writing numbers to make the mathematics visible and concrete rather than abstract. 600 feet altitude divided by 600 feet per minute descent equals 1 minute of available flight time. That's the absolute maximum, assuming worst-case descent rate. Now factor in ground speed. Glider airspeed of 65 miles per hour minus 25 mile per hour headwind equals 40 miles per hour ground speed. 40 miles per hour equals 0.67 miles per minute of forward travel. 1 minute of flight time multiplied by 0.67 miles per minute equals 0.67 miles of total glide range. Cooper looked directly at Morrison. 0.67 miles, sir. Less than 3/4 of a mile. Not 3 miles. Not even close. The gliders physically cannot reach shore from a 3-mile release point under these wind conditions. They will crash in the Mediterranean several hundred meters from land. The gliders will sink within minutes because they're not designed to float. Men will drown trapped inside while wearing combat equipment that makes swimming impossible. This isn't pessimism or overcaution. This is physics. The numbers don't lie. Morrison's expression hardened, and his voice became colder while remaining professionally controlled. Flight Lieutenant Cooper, we have qualified aeronautical engineers who have calculated these specifications carefully. Engineers with university degrees in aerodynamics and fluid dynamics. Engineers who understand aircraft performance calculations better than operational pilots who fly by instinct and accumulated experience rather than rigorous mathematical analysis. Cooper felt frustration rising, but kept his voice calm and professional. Sir, with respect, I'm not flying by instinct. I'm using the same mathematics those engineers use, except I'm applying realistic input values based on 18 months of operational experience, rather than manufacturer test conditions. The engineers are correct about the 12-to-1 glide ratio under calm conditions. I'm not disputing their calculations. I'm disputing the assumption that calm conditions will exist over the Mediterranean in July. But Morrison wasn't interested in further debate. We have experienced planning staff who have designed this operation through months of detailed analytical work. We have operational requirements that must be met on schedule. We have timeline constraints that cannot be adjusted. We have coordination requirements with naval forces and ground forces that depend on precise timing that's already been communicated through multiple command levels and cannot be changed without disrupting the entire invasion sequence. Your concerns are noted and will be included in the mission file for documentation purposes, but we will proceed with the planned release points and altitudes as designed. The specifications we're using are sound. The planning process has been professional and thorough. The gliders will reach shore successfully. Are there any other questions from anyone else in the room? Silence. No one spoke. The implicit message was unmistakably clear. Discussion was closed, planning was finalized, concerns from operational pilots were noted for the record, but dismissed as overcautious pessimism from someone who didn't understand the strategic picture. Bureaucracy had spoken with authority that couldn't be challenged without career consequences. The briefing continued with other topics: navigation checkpoints, radio frequencies, signal protocols, all the tactical details that mattered enormously if you assumed the fundamental plan was sound, if you assumed gliders would reach shore, if you assumed physics would cooperate with operational requirements and strategic timelines. Cooper tried again after the briefing ended, catching Morrison in the hallway outside the briefing room. Sir, please reconsider the release parameters before we finalize the operation. I'm not being overcautious or pessimistic. This is pure mathematics. Physics doesn't negotiate with planning documents. If wind speed is 25 miles per hour and release altitude is 600 feet, gliders mathematically cannot reach shore. It's physically impossible given the aerodynamics involved. Morrison's response was immediate and cold. Flight Lieutenant, are you refusing to fly this mission? No, sir. I'm trying to prevent a disaster. I'm asking you to adjust the operational plan to account for actual performance rather than theoretical performance so that we don't kill our own troops through planning errors. The plan is finalized. The invasion is scheduled. Supreme Allied Command has approved the operation. We cannot change fundamental operational parameters because one pilot is nervous about wind conditions. Hundreds of staff officers and planners have worked on this operation for months. Your concerns have been noted in the official record and dismissed by qualified engineers. You will fly your assigned mission. That's a direct order. Cooper returned to his squadron frustrated and angry, knowing that men would die because planners had ignored physics in favor of bureaucratic confidence, knowing that he would personally be towing gliders to their deaths, knowing that his warnings would be proven correct in the worst possible way while men drowned in the Mediterranean. But he didn't stop with the verbal warning that Morrison had dismissed so decisively. Cooper spent the next 2 days writing the most detailed technical report of his military career. 8 pages of dense aerodynamic analysis backed by mathematics that couldn't be argued with if you actually understood the physics involved. The report began with a clear statement of the problem. Planned release altitude of 600 feet combined with forecast wind conditions of 20 to 25 miles per hour would result in gliders crashing into water before reaching shore. Cooper then methodically worked through the calculations, showing each step of his mathematical reasoning so that anyone reviewing the report could verify his conclusions independently. Section 1 covered theoretical glide performance under manufacturer specifications. 12:1 glide ratio in calm air. 600 feet altitude producing 7,200 feet of horizontal range, equivalent to 1.4 miles. Cooper acknowledged these specifications as accurate under test conditions and explained that he wasn't disputing the manufacturer's engineering or testing procedures. Section 2 analyzed real-world performance degradation under wind conditions. He explained how headwind increased drag coefficients, created turbulence over wing surfaces, and reduced lift efficiency. He cited specific examples from his previous missions, where he had observed and documented actual descent rates under various wind conditions. 25-mile-per-hour headwind typically increased descent rate from 200 feet per minute to 500 feet per minute, a 250% increase that manufacturer specifications didn't account for. Section 3 presented the critical calculation using realistic input values: 600 feet altitude, 500 feet per minute descent rate, 1.2 minutes of available flight time, 65 mile per hour airspeed minus 25 mile per hour headwind equals 40 mile per hour ground speed. 1.2 minutes at 40 mile per hour equals 0.8 miles of glide range maximum. Less than 1 mile. Far short of the 3 miles needed to reach shore from the planned release point. Section 4 provided specific recommendations for adjusting the operational plan to account for real-world conditions. Option 1. Move the release point to within 1 mile of shore, which would require reworking the entire flight path and potentially exposing transport aircraft to coastal anti-aircraft defenses. Option 2. Increase release altitude to 1,200 feet, which would provide adequate margin even with wind degradation, but would require flying higher earlier in the approach and would increase vulnerability to enemy fighters. Option 3. Delay the operation until weather forecasts showed wind conditions below 15 miles per hour, which would allow the existing plan to work with minimal modification. Section 5 acknowledged the operational constraints and strategic imperatives. Cooper understood that the invasion schedule was driven by factors beyond aerodynamics. He recognized that coordination with naval and ground forces created timeline pressures. He accepted that his recommendations might not be tactically or strategically feasible, but he emphasized that ignoring aerodynamic reality wouldn't make physics cooperate with operational requirements. The gliders would crash regardless of how important the mission was or how carefully it had been planned. Cooper submitted his 8-page report through official channels to Morrison's planning office, with copies to his squadron commander, to the Air Operations Staff Coordinator, and to the Senior Royal Air Force Liaison Officer attached to theater headquarters. He documented everything formally and meticulously so that when the disaster happened, and he remained absolutely certain it would happen unless the plan changed, there would be an official record showing that the problems had been identified, analyzed, and reported through proper channels before the operation launched. Morrison's response arrived 3 days later in the form of a single-paragraph memo that Cooper kept for the rest of his life. The memo acknowledged receipt of Cooper's technical report. It noted that planning staff had reviewed the aerodynamic concerns raised and had consulted with qualified aeronautical engineers who confirmed that the operational parameters were appropriate for the mission requirements. The memo thanked Cooper for his dedication to mission success and his attention to technical detail, then reminded him that operational pilots should focus on executing assigned missions with maximum professionalism, rather than second-guessing strategic planning decisions made by qualified staff officers with access to engineering expertise and broader operational context that pilots in the field couldn't fully appreciate. Cooper read the memo 3 times, then filed it carefully with his copy of the technical report. He knew he would need both documents later when the disaster was being investigated, and when military bureaucracy would be searching for explanations and scapegoats. He had done everything professionally possible to prevent the catastrophe. He had warned clearly. He had calculated precisely. He had documented thoroughly. If senior officers chose to ignore his warnings, the responsibility for the resulting deaths would rest with them, not with him. Cooper continued flying glider missions for the remainder of the war, participating in operations that gradually incorporated lessons learned from Sicily's disasters. He flew during the Normandy invasion 6 months later, using improved glider tactics that reflected better understanding of real-world performance limitations. Release altitudes were higher, release points were closer to shore. Wind forecasts were treated with appropriate skepticism. Coordination with naval forces was more thorough. The lessons had been learned through blood, but they were finally being applied. He saw operational planning slowly improve as more experienced pilots were included in mission design processes. He watched military bureaucracy gradually recognize that expertise came from experience as well as education, that operational knowledge from people who actually flew missions often exceeded theoretical knowledge from people who planned missions from headquarters offices. The changes were incremental and incomplete, but they represented progress toward institutional learning that might prevent future disasters. But Cooper never forgot the 1,752 men who drowned in the Mediterranean because planners had trusted manufacturer specifications over operational experience. He never forgot the detailed warnings that had been dismissed as overcautious pessimism from someone who didn't understand strategic imperatives. He never forgot the disaster that was entirely preventable if anyone in authority had been willing to acknowledge that physics doesn't negotiate with operational schedules. On the night of July 9th, everything Cooper predicted came true with horrifying precision. Wind speed was 35 to 45 miles per hour instead of the forecast 20 to 25. The gliders bucked violently on their tow ropes. Multiple ropes snapped. Gliders fell into the ocean, and then friendly fire from Allied naval forces turned the disaster into a massacre. Of the 137 gliders launched, only 12 landed near their intended objectives. 69 gliders crashed into the Mediterranean and sank. The men aboard those 69 gliders, approximately 2,200 soldiers, either drowned immediately or died of exposure in the water, waiting for rescue that often never came. 56 gliders were released too early or too late, and landed miles from their objectives in areas controlled by enemy forces, where the troops were either killed or captured. The official casualty report listed 1,752 dead or missing from Operation Ladbrokes. Nearly half the invasion force eliminated not through enemy action, but through planning failures, coordination breakdowns, and meteorological conditions that Cooper had warned about in writing 5 weeks before the operation launched. The breakdown was devastating when examined in detail. 69 gliders crashed into the Mediterranean and sank completely. That accounted for approximately 2,200 soldiers, who either drowned immediately upon impact or died of exposure while floating in the water, waiting for rescue that came too late, or never came at all. The water temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia within hours, and men wearing combat equipment couldn't stay afloat long enough to reach shore, even when they survived the initial crash. 56 additional gliders were released either too early or too late due to navigation errors and coordination failures, landing miles from their intended objectives in areas fully controlled by Italian and German forces. The troops aboard those gliders fought briefly before being overwhelmed, killed, or captured. Only 12 gliders out of 137 actually landed near their assigned objectives and managed to contribute meaningfully to the invasion effort. The bridge that was supposed to be captured by the glider assault remained under enemy control until ground forces advancing from the beaches finally secured it 18 hours behind schedule. The delay disrupted the entire invasion timeline and caused additional casualties among the amphibious forces who faced stronger resistance than they would have encountered if the airborne assault had succeeded as planned. 3 days after the disaster, Cooper was summoned to an investigation hearing at headquarters in Tunisia. Morrison was there along with 4 other senior officers who had been tasked by Theater Command with determining what had gone wrong and who was responsible for the catastrophic failure. Cooper brought 2 documents to the hearing: his copy of the 8-page technical report he'd submitted 5 weeks before the operation, and his copy of Morrison's 1-paragraph dismissive response, rejecting all his recommendations. The questioning began with standard procedural matters, but became increasingly tense as Cooper methodically explained how every problem he'd predicted had occurred precisely as his calculations had indicated. The gliders had insufficient glide range under actual wind conditions. They crashed into water well short of land. Men drowned by the hundreds. The mathematics he'd provided in his report had been completely accurate. The physics had behaved exactly as aerodynamic theory predicted. The warnings had been correct in every detail. The planning had been catastrophically wrong. Morrison attempted to defend the operational planning by emphasizing the meteorological forecast error, arguing that the disaster was primarily caused by unpredicted weather conditions rather than fundamental planning deficiencies. The forecast had called for 20 to 25 mile-per-hour winds, but actual conditions had been 35 to 45 mile-per-hour gusts. The Weather Service had failed to predict the stronger winds, and that failure was beyond the control of the planning staff. Cooper responded by opening his technical report to page 4 and reading from his analysis. I specifically calculated glide range under the forecast wind conditions of 20 to 25 mile per hour, which I noted in writing would be insufficient for gliders to reach shore from a 3-mile release point. Even if the weather forecast had been perfectly accurate, which it wasn't, the plan would still have resulted in gliders crashing into the Mediterranean. The actual wind conditions made the disaster worse and killed more men, but the fundamental problem existed even under the optimistic forecast scenarios. The plan ignored real-world aerodynamics from the beginning. One of the investigating officers, a Colonel Cooper didn't recognize, asked a question that went directly to the heart of the matter. Flight Lieutenant, if you believed the mission plan would fail, why didn't you refuse to fly? Why didn't you escalate your concerns through channels beyond Wing Commander Morrison? Why did you participate in an operation you believed would result in mass casualties? Cooper had anticipated this question and had his answer prepared. Sir, I documented my concerns through official channels in the form of an 8-page technical report submitted 5 weeks before the operation. I provided detailed mathematical analysis, aerodynamic calculations, and specific recommendations for adjusting the plan. I fulfilled my professional and moral responsibility to warn about problems I could foresee. My warnings were reviewed by planning staff who claimed superior expertise and were dismissed officially. He paused before continuing with the more difficult part of his answer. Regarding why I didn't refuse to fly, refusing a direct order during wartime carries consequences including court-martial, imprisonment, and dishonorable discharge. I'm a military officer subject to military law. I cannot refuse lawful orders simply because I disagree with the planning behind those orders. I can provide warnings, which I did. I can document concerns, which I did. I can recommend changes, which I did. But I cannot refuse to execute missions that senior officers have approved unless those orders are clearly illegal, which these were not. They were simply poorly planned based on theoretical assumptions that ignored operational reality. The colonel nodded slowly, seeming to understand the impossible position Cooper had been in. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with increasingly detailed questions about wind calculations, glide performance, coordination failures, and the friendly fire incident that had killed additional crews. Cooper answered every question precisely and professionally, referring frequently to his written report to show that he had predicted not just the general failure, but many of the specific problems that occurred. The hearing ended without immediate conclusions. Cooper was thanked formally for his testimony and dismissed from the room. He never received any official communication about the investigation's findings, but certain outcomes became apparent over the following weeks. Morrison was quietly transferred to a logistics planning role at a training base in England several weeks after the investigation concluded. The transfer was presented as a routine rotation rather than a disciplinary action. No public acknowledgement of planning failures was ever made. No formal reprimand appeared in Morrison's service record, at least none that was visible to anyone outside the senior command structure. He simply disappeared from operational planning and spent the remainder of the war managing equipment inventories and training schedules, where his mistakes couldn't kill additional soldiers. No one ever apologized to Cooper for dismissing his warnings. No one acknowledged officially that his calculations had been correct and could have saved 1,752 lives if someone in authority had listened. Military institutions don't easily admit that bureaucratic processes failed and that lower-ranking personnel were right when senior officers were wrong. Cooper continued flying missions for the remainder of the war. He participated in the Normandy invasion using improved glider tactics that incorporated lessons learned from the Sicily disaster. He saw operational planning gradually improve as more experienced pilots were included in mission design. He watched military bureaucracy slowly learn that theoretical specifications couldn't override operational reality. But he never forgot the men who drowned in the Mediterranean because planners had trusted manufacturer specifications over operational experience. He never forgot the warnings that were dismissed. He never forgot the disaster that was entirely preventable if anyone in authority had been willing to listen to someone with lower rank but greater relevant knowledge. After the war, Cooper wrote a detailed account of the Sicily operation and the warnings he'd provided. He documented the planning failures, the bureaucratic dismissals, the predictable disaster, and the aftermath where no one accepted responsibility. He submitted his account to military historians who were compiling records of airborne operations. His account was filed away and largely forgotten. It wasn't dramatic enough for popular histories. It didn't fit clean narratives about heroic operations or tragic but unavoidable losses. It was just a story about bureaucratic failure and ignored warnings and preventable deaths, uncomfortable truths that military institutions preferred not to emphasize. Cooper died in 1987 at age 71. His obituary mentioned his wartime service flying glider missions, but didn't mention the Sicily disaster or the warnings he'd provided. The men who drowned never knew that someone had tried to save them through mathematical analysis and formal reports that planning staff dismissed as overcautious pessimism. The lesson from Cooper's story isn't that all warnings should be heeded or that all operational concerns should override strategic planning. Organizations must make difficult decisions balancing multiple factors and competing priorities. Planning staff must work with imperfect information and uncertain forecasts. But the lesson is that expertise comes from experience, not just education. That operational knowledge from people who actually perform tasks often exceeds theoretical knowledge from people who plan tasks. That warnings backed by mathematics and physics shouldn't be dismissed because they come from someone with insufficient rank. That bureaucratic confidence often masks ignorance of critical details. that the gap between theoretical performance and actual performance can kill people when plans ignore reality. Flight Lieutenant David Cooper predicted a disaster with mathematical precision 5 weeks before it occurred. He documented his predictions in writing. He explained the physics. He recommended solutions. He was dismissed by planning staff who trusted manufacturer specifications over operational experience. And 1,752 men died exactly as he predicted, proving his warnings correct while demonstrating that military bureaucracy sometimes values hierarchy over truth and confidence over competence. Remember Cooper. Remember his warnings. Remember the men who drowned because someone with authority decided that planning documents mattered more than physics. Remember that mathematics doesn't negotiate with operational requirements, and that physics doesn't care about strategic timelines, and that ignoring expert warnings because they're inconvenient creates disasters that kill the people those warnings should have saved. That is the complete accounting of the ignored prophet and the disaster he predicted. A story about warnings dismissed, mathematics ignored, and men who died because bureaucracy valued confidence over competence and hierarchy over truth.